Where is the file at? Where is it pulling this from? Okay, why is it so huge? Is it even getting smaller? Oh my god. Did I finally figure it out? I think I might have finally figured it out. It is incredible how complicated this can be. Okay. All right. Wow. Make it a little smaller, but not too small. Finally. All right. Ooh. Just make sure that took me a full 20 minutes to figure this out. All right. know I'm worrying about chat, considering that this is not likely to be seen by anybody for now. Alright. Holy schlamoli. Alright. So, welcome everybody. Come on in, join us. We're going to start here with chapter 1 of what is probably my favorite novel of all time, The Great Gatsby. Wonderfully in the public domain, and something that I've taught very, very many times to very, very many students, more than I'd be able to accurately identify. I'm just going to read it, and I'm going to talk through it as we go along. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Then wear the gold hat if that will move her. If you can bounce high, bounce for her too. Till she cry, lover, gold-hatted, high-bouncing lover, I must have you. That's by Thomas Parkden Villiers. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know. I also don't know who that is. I didn't research that. But what I can tell you is that this is kind of like a summary of the plot to a certain extent, or at least the character motivations of Mr. Gatsby in his pursuit of Daisy, the woman he lost due to circumstances and insecurity. Chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. Now, I would urge everybody to think what they think this means. What does it mean? What is this advice from the narrator, who's Nick Carraway? What does it seem like to you that his father's advice means? Think about that for a second before we continue on. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgment, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. I always stop here, or sometimes I read the rest of the paragraph here, but generally I always stop here because what was the advice of the father? When you feel like criticizing anyone, remember that all the people in the world haven't had the advantages that you've had. I think most people read this as like, check your privilege, right? Remember that not everybody has what you have, so don't judge. And Nick takes this to heart in a sense, because he does say he's inclined to reserve all judgments, but then he goes and says, and this is where I identify that he seems a little bit hypocritical here. A habit, his reserving of judgment, has opened up many curious natures to him. He's benefited from it to some extent, but it's also made him the victim of not a few veteran bores, which isn't exactly reserving judgment, now is it? That is him calling people veteran bores, or it's saying that that these people are quite boring. It's not reserving judgment. And we see this continue towards the end of the paragraph here. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. So he, in my mind, totally misunderstands his father's advice. His father's advice is don't be judgmental, and he goes and be judgmental. So, saying that not everybody is born equally decent. He thinks there are good people and there are bad people. And he also thinks that he's one of the good people and he has the right to judge. This is something I always try to advise students when we're starting out reading this book, that this is something that even I've found that a lot of teachers miss, because it is actually kind of easy to miss if you're not reading closely. It certainly wasn't something that I was aware of when I first started reading the book, because if you read this book straight through without realizing that Nick is actually a bit of a jerk and is a bit unaware of his own limitations and his own tendencies, then this is kind of just a bit of a soap opera, a very well-written soap opera, but you're kind of missing some of the point, I find, if you're not aware from the very beginning that the narrator is unreliable, that Nick is, in fact, kind of a jerk. So, he's told us about his relationship with his father, and so we'll continue. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Well, no kidding. You've just told us that your tolerance of others already has a limit with these veteran bores and these people who had a fundamental decency that is unequal to others. But I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in a uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. This is implying that he had a rough time with some crazy people last year, and when he came back from the East, i.e. the New York area, he was kind of sick of it. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, successful gestures. Some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No. Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It was what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So we can just start off right away with the idea that a lot of people put forward, that Nick is in love with Gatsby, and that he's romantically unloved, and he thinks Gatsby is a hottie, and that he really likes him, and in a romantic way. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support this. We start out the book with Nick saying, I hated every dang thing that happened to me last year, and it all stunk. And it wasn't moral, and it wasn't good, and it was distracting, and it was, and so now I want everything to be better than that. but not Gatsby. I like Gatsby, he says. Gatsby was okay. It was the stuff around Gatsby. He's already carving out a space for Gatsby to be. We're about to see an awful lot of judgment of awful lot of characters, and he's setting out like, look, at the end of it, I like the guy. I really like the guy. I don't think, in fact, that I'm ever going to meet anybody that I like as much as Gatsby, he says. We'll keep an eye out for Nick is in love with Gatsby as we go along here. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for 3 generations. Where is this Middle Western city? He never says. Is it like Cincinnati, Chicago? It's the Midwest. It's probably Ohio or Illinois, something like that. I like to imagine it's Chicago, personally, but it could be anywhere in what's now the Rust Belt. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. I think that's what it is, Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 1951, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. So it's like family, it's familial wealth, hardware family. Nick is not poor. He's not as rich as some of the other characters that we meet, but Nick is far from poor, and it's ancestral wealth as well. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. He's very clever and proud of himself. I never noticed this little reference. Delayed Teutonic migration, Teutonic meaning German, and so a delayed Teutonic migration would be the fact that before World War I, there was a very long period of a buildup of tension between the British and French, the Germans and the French, and the Germans and the British, and basically it was a long time coming that everybody was eventually anticipating some sort of German military activity prior to World War I. And so that's why you get in World War I like what they called the summer of madness, of everybody kind of losing their minds and going out in the streets and passionately signing up to compete in what was perceived at the time as a patriotic war of national pride. So he's being very tongue-in-cheek here, because at the time that this book was written, they definitely knew that World War I was terrible and bad and it was a stinky thing. But at the time before, this Teutonic migration, this delayed Teutonic migration, was not seen at the very beginning of the thing. Anyway, it was seen as an inevitable imperial effort. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly, the counter-raid being the Allied, the Entente, I like saying French words as French as possible, the Entente powers coming together to resist the Germans' attempt to conquer parts of France, being the counter-raid. Again, he's being very dry, very tongue-in-cheek here. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. And I think there is a thread of PTSD in this book. It is never explicitly mentioned, but I think both Nick and Gatsby in this book have a little bit of a the war affected them, but they don't talk about it. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. A little bit of a shell shock, or seeing things that you wish that you hadn't seen. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays I came east, permanently I thought, in the spring of 22. So this is very soon after World War One, which I believe ended in 20, or at least late 19 to 20, I believe. I'd have to look it up. Why don't we Google it? 1918. Okay. Well, there you go. That's the armistice, is 1918. I don't know. Who am I apologizing to? I can edit it out because nobody's watching this. I probably won't. But father agreed to finance me for a year. Okay, so I like this bit where he's talking to his family. His aunts and uncles are talking it over. So it's not even his dad who's hooking him up with this job on Wall Street, but it's his entire extended family. This is a guy who comes from generational wealth. They're giving him a job. Like, they're choosing a prep school for him. Like, he's still kind of a child, even though as we find out, he's about to turn 30 years old, which 30 years old back then was a lot older than 30 years old is now. I always think of, like, Walt Disney. When I think about how people used to think old was back in the day, when Walt Disney was, like, full-blown in charge of, like, Snow White has been released, and the Disney Corporation, the Disney film studio, animation studio is just starting off. He's acting like this old man and as this avuncular father figure to all of his animators in the Disney studios, and he's telling them, like, oh boy, you youngsters, and he's 30. Like, he's 30 years old at this point. It was seen as the turning point of you're now in straight middle age, and let me tell you that it's not the case for most people over 30 anymore. They're not kidding when they say 40 is the new 30. The practical thing was to find me rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, i.e. France, World War I. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in the commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found a house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month. And so I've looked this up. A weather-beaten, this would be the equivalent in modern money of like $8,000 a month for this quote-unquote weather-beaten cardboard bungalow. That's a lot for rent. If you don't know rent, $8,000 a month is quite a lot of money for rent, even in a place where rent is quite expensive. This is not a poor guy. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog. At least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. So he has no roommate. He had a dog that ran away. This is one of those things that it's like, why did the dog run away? Why was Nick not paying attention? Why is Fitzgerald mentioning a dog here other than to show that Nick's maybe not the most conscientious guy, that maybe he has a hard time paying attention about or caring about other people. And he's not even taking care of himself. He's got a live-in maid, which was more common back at the time, so that's hard to say that it means that much. But this Finnish woman who takes care of his house is not a character. I think she shows up one more time in like chapter 4 when Gatsby comes over. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with summer. So, we're through the threshold here. We are in the East. We are in New York. Nick he belongs here. He's not from here, but he feels like he's in a new phase of his life. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas, I think, something like that, Maecenas, knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. I feel like there's something that could be said here. He doesn't want to be a jack of all trades, master of none. He's a little bit derisive of that. He appreciates a Renaissance man. But he says that he'd be more successful if he was more focused, which was probably true given how the rest of the story goes here. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, Long Island, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, 2 unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals. Like the egg in the Columbus story, they are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. So let's take a look at the map of Long Island here. And let's find the eggs. When he's talking about the eggs, Fitzgerald is referencing these guys right here, which don't really look like eggs to me. But he's talking about these, right, great neck. These are the eggs. I guess they kind of look like smooshed eggs, but it's also, as you can see, quite close to New York. Here. And here are the eggs. Great neck is this is what he's referring to. And we'll get more into the differences between the eggs as we go forward. I don't think we have enough text to really play off of here for now, but the differences between the eggs is an important thematic component of the rest of the book. The dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between 2 huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on that evening. On the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. So, it's not entirely clear. He says they're different in every single respect, and then he doesn't really elaborate on that. I think socially at the time it would have been more clear to the reader the implication of the difference even at this point. But basically, West Egg, new money, East Egg, old money. And if you're not really sure what's the difference between new money and old money, we'll come to that down the line for sure. Her husband, Daisy's husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach, but now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. I mean, really think about that. What it would take even today to move a team of horses from one state to another. That's just like incredibly expensive to imagine. If you just like playing for a game that you play, like it's Tom's rich. Why they came east, I don't know. We will find out. It becomes implied later. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully whenever people played polo, or wherever people played polo, and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. This is thematic underscoring of a major degree. Drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for could also be the title of this book. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold, and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. Now, when I teach this, I really like to slow down and look at these paragraphs, because I feel this is when the book really starts cooking. This paragraph, actually, is where I think the book really starts cooking, because we have some beautiful underlining, some beautiful support for the wealth. Like, tell me you're rich without telling me you're rich, right? Show, don't tell. With the activity here, the energy, the lawn started at the beach, and the lawn, right? This is basically personification, although it toes the line for personification, I think. The lawn ran toward the front door, jumped over the sundials and burning gardens, and it reached the house drifting up the side like a car in an action movie, like doing a full, like, has that feeling of like doing a power slide up the side of the house. That's just really effective to me. And then we also have the language about gold, like sun and burning. It's got motion and energy, and all of that motion and energy that is not explicit. Like, it's not textual, it's more subtextual, right? It's more poetic and infusing the text with that feeling. So we have run, jump, drift, and then we also have sun, burn, glow, gold, and all of this energy and glowing. It's coming to rest wide open in the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. This is a man of power and energy, a Zeus-like figure. Now, he doesn't, well, okay, I will say he does actually act very Zeus-like in this book, in the actual sense of like Zeus in the stories of being kind of a cad and a guy who cheats on his wife and is not reliable at all and gets away with every bad thing that he does because he's Tom Buchanan. I mean, he's basically Zeus because he's Zeus. What are you going to tell Zeus, the god of lightning, who could just smite you from Mount Olympus, that he stinks and you don't like him? He doesn't care that you don't like him because he's Zeus. And that's Tom Buchanan, basically Zeus. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Supercilious, one of my favorite vocab words. It literally means upper hair, like supercilious, and it's just like raised eyebrows, like this is supercilious, looking down, a hair above your eye, raising your eyebrows and looking down. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage. A cruel body. There's a physicality in this book, and certainly a homosexuality, or at least a homoeroticism in this book, of just the human body and like the leverage here. It's not just the leverage that he has physically as a big, strong man. It's also the leverage that he has as a rich guy, right? A metaphorical leverage. And Nick is also quite enamored of the male form, as we'll see throughout the book as well. You'll see multiple cases of Nick paying pretty close attention to how dudes look. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness that he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. And you're going to hate his guts by the end of this, too. Zeus is not a likable guy. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. Now, I don't mean to counteract Nick here, because I don't know. He's a fictional character, and it's kind of hard to say what he thinks since he doesn't exist. But I think it's funny that he says, this guy is a huge jerk, nobody likes him, and he's just a real jerk. But I think he likes me. I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. Does he, Nick? Or did you kind of think he was hot and you were kind of into him, but he was a jerk? I don't know. This just feels like Nick saying, like, everybody likes me. He's a people pleaser, right? We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch, but the thing is also, to roll back, the thing is, maybe he did. Maybe throughout, Tom does seem to kind of like Nick in some fashion. So I don't think he's totally off base. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. Now, I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Dumaine, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. He's very cursory. He has nothing to prove to anybody, like, in terms of his wealth and power. He knows what his wealth and power are, and he knows where he is relative to others. He's a man very aware of social position. He doesn't have to show off to Nick. He knows he doesn't have to show off to Nick. He's like, yeah, I got a nice place. What do you think? Yeah, let's go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. Again, we have power, right? We have motion, we have energy, even in stationary objects or inanimate objects are filled with energy. A very magical feeling. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. We have another godlike entrance here for the only other characters in the story that matter besides Mr. G, Mr. Great Gatsby, Jordan, and Daisy. And I also like to point out in this paragraph that if we have kind of like power, fire, energy, motion for Tom's introduction, we have kind of like ethereal, angelic, holy wind for Jordan and Daisy here. They're both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering, literally saying as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. Like, you can imagine like this big intricate couch carrying these two women just being carried and drifting about the house. And I just love, as from a poetry perspective, the caught wind died out about the room. It, like, the rhythm of the caught wind died out about the room. It follows the same thing. Pardon me for getting too deep on these, but I've spent so much time with this text that I've noticed some of these things. Is it intentional? Did Fitzgerald mean to have the caught wind died out about the room sound like what it sounds like when something dies down? Maybe he did. This is so intricately constructed that it's very possible that he's just like, ooh, I like it. Like, oh, he had a good day that day. Like, he's like, ooh, I like that, he said. But also, perhaps he just vibed on it and it came out that way. And he's like, that sounds good, but he didn't notice that kind of dying out about the room emphasizes the point that's being made in the moment. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. She's like kind of balancing here, maybe looking over to the side. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned forward with a conscientious expression, then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too, and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again, and as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. So Daisy is one of my favorite characters in this. She's not a very likable character, but she is I really quite enjoy Daisy in this story because she's so well drawn as a figure. She's one of those girls like, oh, ever so much. Oh, shall we? Oh, she's very social and bringing everybody in, but it's also very kind of fake, because she's a people pleaser. This is her role. This is what she's taken on. This is her personality. Yeah. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Jordan is very self-possessed. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. Low, thrilling voice like this. Can you imagine? If someone was talking to you like this, you'd have to lean in and really, you'd like, and it would be very conspiratorial, wouldn't it? And then you would feel very connected to that person just because they're so excitedly talking just to you. This is Daisy. She talks to everybody like this. Doesn't it? It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it. I love that. Her face was I'm going to notice things that I never noticed before. I never noticed that line before. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it. Bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth, but there was an excitement in her voice that men who cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, inciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I think we've all known people like that. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. Oh, the whole town is desolate. All the cars have left the rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, you ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 2 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never? Well, you ought to see her. She's... Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. What are you doing, Nick? So, I never noticed this before, but Tom just doesn't want to listen to his wife talk about the baby. And he doesn't want to have a dude be doing women things. And so he straight up interrupts what Daisy's talking about and just is like, well, I want to talk about guy stuff. What are you doing? Oh, let me do my Tom voice. What are you doing, Nick? I'm a bond man. Who with? I told him. Never heard of them, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. Of course it did. He's being dismissive of your job. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East. Don't you worry, he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, Absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. Oop. Hello? Yes. Oh, yes, I will. Hey, little girl. What are you doing? What's going on? Hmm? Oh, Mama. What a cutie. Good thing about this is that nobody's watching and I can edit this out later. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But I am going to finish reading this chapter. So just a little thing that occurs to me is like, whoa, I'll try to get more space up in here. Maybe make my head smaller. Yeah, that's a little better. Part of me, my work is connecting. Okay. One thing that I like here is that they're just talking about like how good it is to live in New York, which is another thing that I've heard people who live in New York say a lot. Like, oh, why would you want to live anywhere else, and et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's nice, but you know, like sometimes people who live in the city gotta say they say like, oh, why would you? Oh, because there are a lot of sacrifices that you make to live in the city, and you have to justify, you have to constantly justify yourself while you're there. That's a whole other thing. I could do a whole video about that at another time of like urban versus rural, you know, but, yeah, there's always people who are like, oh, it's so much better here than it is there because they're so different. And there are, you know, people in the country say that about the city and people in the city say that about the country because you can't get all of it everywhere all at once. Anyway, I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. I'm gonna give Jordan a little bit of Lumpy Space Princess from Adventure Time. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Oh, don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are? He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of the glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl, with an erect carriage which she accented by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her, somewhere before. Like, she's like the quintessential 1920s flapper girl, Art Deco, like, very, very, erect and angular and formed in a kind of a Tiffany, Chanel little black dress kind of way. You live in West Egg, she remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single... You must know Gatsby. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Now, I want to point out something that is going to happen throughout this book. People are kind of talking crosswise at each other, and you have to imagine what's going on as they're talking to each other. I'm going to try to not interrupt as much when we get into the dialogue points to try to give the little bit of the back and forth. You really have to read between the lines with the dialogue and to get character motivations, and you kind of have to envision it in your head as what's going on, because it's very much showing, not telling, with the dialogue here. You live in West Egg, she remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single... You must know Gatsby. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Now, what Gatsby, this is kind of the little ping, because obviously Gatsby is her former boyfriend from before the war. Now, that is why she recognizes the name, but maybe she's like, Gatsby? I know a Gatsby. Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Again, all that physicality. There was a lot of physicality in the description of Jordan as well. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day in the year. She looked at us all radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. Again, there's certain things that, like sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. Like, she's bored, she's been here before, there's nothing exciting here, she's hanging out with her rich friends and getting drunk. All right, said Daisy. What do we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? This is that kind of drawing you in, like she's purposefully not making any decisions because she lives for others. In a, like, weirdly a selfish way, as we'll find out. Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great big hulking physical specimen of a... I hate that word, hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening too would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase toward its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. I like this because I feel like this is a little bit of a time capsule of we can get a sense of how people socialized in the past, or how much more seriously they often took it than maybe they do now, or maybe it's an East Coast thing that I, as a Midwestern guy, am not as familiar with. But this distinction that Nick is making here is not a distinction that is easy for me to comprehend. I think, kind of the chilled, laid back, too cool for school of the Buchanans and Jordan versus the kind of like trying too hard of the Midwest. I think that's kind of the vibe that he's establishing there. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impressive. Like, what are you even talking about? Corky but rather impressive? Like, is it good or is it not good? Are you judging it or are you appreciating it? This is the tension of Nick throughout the whole thing. Quirky but rather impressive Claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Now, this is a real book, and this is a real thing that was going on in society in America in the 1920s. It was going on internationally, but racial, what is it called? Oh, social Darwinism. The idea of mixing blood being bad and things like that. And even at the time, this would have been a red flag for Tom being a racist and a jerk. Like, for the readers of The Great Gatsby at the time, it paints him with a very particular brush. Tom's been, and Daisy tries to change the subject. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. Oh, it's like, Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word she's trying to change the subject into the human connection. That word we. Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out. These other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization, science and art and all that. Do you see? I don't know what Daisy's thing is that he says that she's not white in some fashion. I think she's like Irish or something. He's intimating that she's not quite as white as Jordan and Nick and Tom. There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized on the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. He's a little drunk, Nick. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. That's a lot of silver. He had to polish it from morning till night until finally it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Baker. I can't turn off Lumpy Space Princess. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Baker. Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine... We don't even know what the deal is with this guy and the silver and the polishing. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affectation upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. Like Daisy's charming. She's presented in a very charming way. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. So Tom gets called away from the table for a phone call, and Daisy knows what's going on, right? As if his absence quickened something within her. This is very show don't tell, right? I'm reading between the lines. So Tom goes somewhere else because the butler said, like, you've got a phone call. Daisy knows what phone call means. Phone call means it's Myrtle, Tom's mistress. So she's feeling anxiety because, of course she does, because her husband is cheating on her. And she knows it. But they've got an arrangement or something. It's more complicated. She's come to terms with Tom's cheating. But it still makes her mad. So she changes the subject. Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. I'd love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose? This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then, suddenly, she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. She can't keep it. She's got to go check it out. She's angry. Of course she is. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, "Shh!" in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, then ceased altogether. This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of as my neighbor, I said. Don't talk, I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean to say you don't know? Said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. I thought everybody knew. I don't. Why, she said hesitantly, Tom's got some woman in New York. Got some woman? I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. It couldn't be helped, cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and continued. I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over on the Cunard or White Star line. He's singing away. Her voice sang. It's romantic, isn't it, Tom? Very romantic, he said, and then miserably to me, if it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables. The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, Don't you dare go answer that phone with your mistress on it. You are gonna take Nick down to the stables, and we are gonna go walk in the nighttime, and you're not talking to her right now. This is all communicated in just just a little shake of the head. The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, at the subject of the stables. In fact, all subjects vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. So they're just sitting there, and the phone is ringing while they're just sitting there, like not saying anything, not looking at each other, but not looking at each other. To a certain temperament, the situation might have seemed intriguing, My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Wicker settee being like a wicker chair. Like a love seat or something. Daisy took her face in her hands, as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. Like, hey, look, I don't want to get too emotional here, but I can tell that you're kind of worked up about this whole thing that I've just found out about, and I don't know anything about, and I know you're about to talk to me, but please don't talk to me. We don't know each other very well, Nick. We don't know each other very well, Nick, she said suddenly, even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war. That's true. She hesitated. Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything. Evidently, she had reason to be. The reason being the phone call and the mistress and all of that. Again, this is not very explicitly told. If you read this chapter too fast, you kind of don't know what's going on. I've had a lot of students skip right over this like a rock off the top of a pool of water. Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. I suppose she talks and eats and everything? Oh, yeah. She looked at me absently. Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear? No. Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said. I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people. And I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated! God, I'm sophisticated. The instant her voice broke off. Okay, so now we really get introduced to Daisy here, like the real Daisy underneath the social flightiness. She's very insecure about her relationship with her husband. She feels like she doesn't have any control over her own life. And she is pretty disdainful of what she is living in right now with her husband and the shrill ringing of the phone with his mistress on the other end. The instant her voice, but this is how Nick responds to it. The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. Like, he doesn't have sympathy for her. He feels like she's more complicit than she actually is. And he's pretty astute because she definitely does. Like, Daisy could just leave Tom, but she doesn't. And Nick is kind of judging her for that. I felt the basic, it made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. Like, this is such a cold thing for him to say. It's like, the only reason that she brought me to dinner was to get me to care about her situation and feel bad for her. Maybe it was, but maybe you should care, Nick. Maybe you should. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. The secret society of, like, being an adult and, like, having an adult relationship and, like, being married but your husband is cheating, and that's just what married people do, she's thinking. And Nick is like, don't feed me that nonsense of like, oh, you're not, I'm too parochial, I'm too countrified to understand the really sophisticated version of what this is supposed to be. There's a real clash here. It's even more complicated. Like, this is worthy of like unpacking to a much greater degree than this thing is. This kind of how Nick feels about Tom and Daisy's marriage. Inside the Crimson Room bloomed with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tune. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender bustles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. "To be continued," she said, tossing them. I'm going to do Lumpy Space Princess the whole time. This kind of captures Jordan for me in a real way. "To be continued," she said, tossing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee as she stood up. 10 o'clock, she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. "Time for this good girl to go to bed." "Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow," explained Daisy, "over at Westchester." "Oh, you're Jordan Baker." I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I had heard some story of her too. A critical, unpleasant story, but what it was I had forgotten long ago. "Good night," she said softly. "Wake me at 8, won't you?" "If you'll get up." "I will. Good night, Mr. Carroway. See you soon. See you anon." "Of course you will," confirmed Daisy. "In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of, fling you together. You know, lock you up by accident in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all that sort of thing." "Good night," called Miss Baker from the stairs. "I haven't heard a word." "She's a nice girl," said Tom after a moment. "They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way." "Who oughtn't to?" inquired Daisy coldly. "Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her." Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. "Is she from New York?" I asked quickly. "From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white..." I think she's making fun of Tom. I never noticed that. "Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart talk on the veranda?" demanded Tom suddenly. "Did I?" She looked at me. "I can't seem to remember. But I think we talked about the Nordic race." "Yes, I'm sure we did. It sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know..." "Don't believe everything you hear, Nick," he advised me. So here we have, he's like, "Did you tell him about me and my cheating and our problems?" And she's like, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't." And they're having a marriage spat, and it's just Nick sitting there by himself now. I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, "Wait!" Peremptorily means like imperially, telling you to do something in a demanding way. "I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west." "That's right," corroborated Tom kindly. "We heard that you were engaged." "It's libel. I'm too poor." "But we heard it," insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower-like way. "We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true." Of course I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I had come east. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. So he was supposedly kind of engaged to someone back where came from, but he does not tell us very much about it at all. And basically what we find out later is that he has been dating this girl. He has come east, and he has no intention of marrying her, but she doesn't know that he doesn't have any intention of marrying her. This becomes clear from putting the pieces together later on in the book. It's not a major component, but it's just another one of those things like Nick's kind of a jerk. Their interest rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me the thing for Daisy to do was to rush out of the house, child in arms, but apparently there was no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising than he had been depressed by a book. Something was making him nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep summer on the roadhouse roofs, and in front of wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light, and when I reached my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. I've missed this before. I never caught this line. A persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. That's what, when you got a lot of frogs, that's what they sound like. Wow, wow, wow. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction, but I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and as far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. His arms are outstretched and trembling like he's trying to will himself, because he likes Daisy. Thank you for joining me in this read-through of Chapter 1, in preparation for Chapter 2. I would recommend... I think you're good. Just try to think about, like, who are these characters, right? The question I always ask, part of Spicy, for all character motivations is, who are they? What are their relationships to others? What do they want? And what conflicts prevent them from getting what they want? I wonder if I can type this somewhere. Maybe I will open up a new... Yeah, here we go. Why not? So, who are they? There we go. Still getting used to this. Who are they? What do they want? Oh, my bad. What are their relationships? What do they want? What conflicts prevent them from getting what they want? And so our main characters here, and we've already been introduced to all of them, are Tom, Daisy, Nick, Jordan, Gatsby. Now, we don't know a lot about all of these characters, but we certainly know a little bit about some of them. I would urge you to take a look and take a think about these questions before moving on and reading Chapter 2, which will either be done later this week in a live stream, or you will see the video on the page. So I'd be happy to answer questions if anybody happens to want to watch. But otherwise, thank you for joining me, and you're welcome to join me next time. Take care.